with things like e-commerce platforms, Amazon, Alibaba, Jumia, and pretty much whatever platform you're familiar with, most people tend to think that purchasing in an organization is as simple as going online, checking out what you want, click add to cart, and now it's a waiting game. In organizations, things tend to be way complex and a lot of negotiation is involved, which is why you need to understand how to apply commercial negotiation in the work of procurement. And that will mean you have to know what commercial negotiation is, how negotiation fits in the stages of the sourcing process, sources of conflict that can arise in the work of procurement and supply, and team management, and the influence of stakeholders in negotiation. Okay, look, so as you're going through this, I just want to point out that you can actually go to the website, zeretnetwork.com/courses. The link is in the description. And you can check out not only this video, you can check out other videos as well, other video lessons. And the interesting part is that as you're going through that, you also get to undertake some practice exercises, okay, based on what you've just learned. And at the end of the day, once you're done with the exercise, you can submit, check the details, see which questions you got right, see which questions you got wrong. And if you think, okay, let me redo this entire thing, just click, restart the course and take all that, and redo that again, okay? So the point is, you're trying to make the learning experience as comfortable and as realistic as possible. So you go through a lesson, you test yourself. So you can do that. Anyway, let's continue the video. We all negotiate as we go on with our life. But as for, whether it's successful or not, that kind of just comes down to 4 things. The negotiation approach used, negotiation objectives, power and relationship between the parties, and the kind of people in the negotiation. Negotiation is a basic way of getting what you want from others. It is a back and forth communication designed to reach an agreement when you and the other side have some interest that are shared and others that are opposed. Well, in procurement, negotiation is actually going to lead into a contract. In fact, you see, you just don't get into a contract, right? I mean, if you look at contract law, you assume that you make an offer, somebody accepts that offer, there is consideration, and you have a contract. Assuming you both have the legal capacity and are in intent for legal consequences to follow. But the truth is, you see, the things you say before you get into a contract, those things are called representation. And if they turn out to be false, obviously they're going to be called misrepresentation. Now, the negotiation phase kind of covers the representation because you say some things, they say some things, you propose what you want, they propose what they want, you probably don't agree, and finally, all that happens. So the point is, at the end of the day, that negotiation is designed to get the parties from just a representation stage all the way into a contract. Negotiation can be viewed as a process of planning, reviewing, and analyzing used by a buyer and a seller when trying to reach acceptable agreement or compromises, which include all aspects of the business transaction and not just price. You see, when you focus on price alone, then what you're actually doing is you're just bargaining. And yes, bargaining is part of negotiation. It just isn't the whole negotiation. From a wider context, negotiation may be defined as a process whereby 2 parties come together to confer in a situation in which there is some divergence or conflict of interest between them with a view of concluding a jointly acceptable agreement. Alright, so you can sum negotiation up this way. Negotiation is a process, so it's not just a single event, okay? Choices are made along the way, and those choices are going to determine whether the whole thing is successful or not. So it is a process. Number 2, it involves 2 or more parties. Number 3, there must be differences, because if there are no differences, okay, if you and the other party are in agreement, then what's the point of negotiating? I mean, if you want the same thing, then you just go ahead and do that thing. And next, the parties must need to resolve their differences. That need to resolve those differences that exist is what calls for negotiation, which is not to say that that is the only way you can arrive at a solution, but it's one of the ways to arrive at a solution, through negotiating, because there is something you want, there is something they want, it's probably not the same thing, and so you sort of try to come up with a solution that fits both of you. And negotiation involves trying to reach an agreement. Okay, so with negotiation, there are two broad ways in which agreements can be arrived at. And I'm talking about the negotiator can explore possibility and develop options that might possibly resolve the issue, which is a creative way in which the parties negotiation. So if you are negotiating with somebody else, then it is a creative way of you trying to add value or expand, the value so that everybody gets a win out of that situation. Or negotiators can exchange offers around and between their stated position, in which case you're talking about compromise. Okay, so it's like, I want this thing, you also want that thing, we can't both get what we want, so let's see what are we willing to lose so that we can get something out of this deal. Finally, negotiation can result in an agreement. Now, the thing you have to understand about that, you see, you're saying you're trying to reach an agreement, and finally you're saying, okay, finally you get to an agreement. The agreement doesn't necessarily mean that you get what you wanted, because the agreement can be to walk away. So that is an option in negotiation. It's not always the case that you're going to negotiate and then you're going to arrive at a solution. Sometimes the solution is a walk-away position, okay? You decide that I don't want anything to do with that, and I'm just going to leave. Of course, the real trick is in knowing when to do that, something that you're going to look at as we progress with these videos. So there is that. Those are some of the things that sum up the actual definition of negotiation. While the focus of negotiation is on reaching agreement, the most important aspect of any negotiation is not the agreement itself, but how it is implemented. The agreement is only a part of the outcome in any negotiation. You should realize that negotiation is not the only way to reach or to get what you want from suppliers. Competitive bidding is one of the many alternatives, in which case the suppliers can make the firm bid on terms and prices against specification, and the buyer will choose the best offer. Okay, so that is an alternative. I mean, you can do that. In their book, Purchasing Principles and Management, Bailey et al. Suggest other alternative approaches to reaching agreement, which are persuasion, in which case you try to encourage the other side to accept, to accept your viewpoint without necessarily you giving up something. Giving in which case you accept the other side's offer or the other side's viewpoint without them giving you anything. Coercion, insisting that the other side meet your demands, or else, something is going to happen. Problem solving, in which case you are both trying to arrive at a win-win. So, those are some of the alternatives to, getting whatever you want. Persuasion, giving in, coercion, and problem solving. The question at this point then is, when is it not a good idea to negotiate? In the book, Negotiation and Essentials of Negotiation, written by Lewicki, Sanders, Barry, and Minton, suggests that negotiation should be avoided if one can achieve the objective without negotiating, if the objective is not worth the time and effort of negotiating, if we have compelling alternatives to negotiation, that is, you have a very strong, walk-away position or a very strong alternative to the negotiated agreement, if we risk losing too much by negotiating, if the other party acts in bad faith or unethically, or if waiting, basically doing nothing, will improve your position. So because of the different approaches that people take when they're trying to arrive at a solution, the relationship between buyers, or rather the negotiation between buyers and suppliers, can, at the end of the day, occur at two broad levels. We're talking about strategic or tactical negotiation. Strategic negotiation, this is not your day-to-day kind of negotiation. In fact, it's usually carried out less frequently and at a higher level, usually by senior management from both parties. So with this kind of negotiation, we're talking about the kind of negotiation that addresses, long-range issues, things to do with the direction the company is supposed to go, and things of that nature. Okay, so it's not really something that you do every day. It deals with the nature of the collaboration, the source of competitive advantage to be sought, the mutual strategic benefit of development, and so on. So this sort of negotiation is about ends. Okay, it's about results. What should we be doing together, and what do we each want to get out of it? Now, at this level, again, negotiation tend to be integrative. Basically, it tends to be collaborative because both parties are sort of trying to figure out a way in which they can work together to move forward. Okay, I mean, it's not really I want to win and I want you to lose. It's more of what can we do together and how can that benefit us given the big picture as far as the organizational objective is concerned. Examples of strategic negotiation might include negotiating a joint venture or a partnership agreement, the formulation of supply chain management strategies, an agreement to co-invest in research and development or system integration. And then we have tactical negotiation, which is now your day-to-day negotiation carried out by, the lower levels, things to do with the daily purchasing and things of that nature. Okay, so this is what you're probably going to be involved with if you are not at an executive level in the organization. It addresses short-range issues involving operations, resource allocation, performance and risk management, etc. So at this point, it's all about the means. Remember, the other one was about the ends. So with tactical, you're talking about the means. Okay, who does what, who pays for what, and when, what are the obligations and rights of each party are some of the things involved here. So at this level, the negotiation is more adversarial, okay? It's competitive. It's about win-lose because both parties are seeking to maximize their own organization's share of the value gains and minimize their own organization's share of the risk within the relationship. So I want to win. I want to make my company look better. And the idea is if I'm going to win, then you're probably going to have to lose something. And that is what defines negotiation at this level, okay? The tactical, because it's more of a win-lose kind of situation. And examples of these will include things like negotiation of prices and terms on a supply contract, negotiation of service levels, incentives and penalties, negotiation of solutions to problem and disputes, and so on. So at this point, it's obvious that if you're in the purchasing and supplies business, then you should know how negotiation fits in your entire career. Procurement is the strategic business function that identifies sources, accesses, and manages the external resources that an organization needs to successfully fulfill its objectives. So the procurement process is actually cyclic, and the cyclic nature of that process has the following as, its stages, okay? So we have understanding the need and development of high-level specification, market or commodity options, including make versus buy, okay, assessment, developing a strategy, pre-procurement, market tests, and market engagement, and then development of required documentation such as RFQ, supplier selection to participate in an invitation to tender exercise, issue invitation to tenders or request for quotation, bids, tender or quotation evaluation and validation, contract award and implementation, warehouse logistics and receipts, contract performance review and continuous improvement, supplier relationship or contract management, and finally, asset management or end of life. That is the procurement cycle, right? Now, the question then again is, how does that all fit when we're talking about negotiation? So let's look at that. How does all that, how does the procurement cycle, how does negotiation rather get involved? Okay, how does negotiation get involved in the procurement cycle? And here's how. So the first step is understanding need and development of high-level specification. This is actually where the procurement activities start. This step involves mainly internal negotiation with stakeholders because the idea here is to figure out what do they want? And by what do they want, I mean, what do people in the organization want? Because if you're going to negotiate with outside parties, then there is something you want. Or if it is not you, the people you represent, in this case, it could be a department in the organization that wants to buy laptops. Okay? So the point is, you first of all start from within, try to figure out what exactly are their needs. You're talking about demand management. So demand management is the negotiation between procurement and internal stakeholders over the need, requirement, or specification. You, at this point, need to remember that this is actually your opportunity to figure out how to reduce cost, because if they want something and then you figure out that there is an alternative, a cheap alternative to that thing, then that means you've actually helped your company to reduce costs if they were to go ahead and procure that thing based on what the person who needed it had said. Now, number 2, market or commodity and options research, which will include make or buy assessment. At this point, you're trying to evaluate the bargaining power of, say, the supplier or the buyer, depending on the role you're playing in that negotiation. This will inform how you negotiate. Analysis of the market may suggest it makes more sense to focus on smaller suppliers where leverage may be greater, or focus on larger suppliers due to the likelihood for failure of the smaller suppliers. And then number 3, develop strategy or plan. So this is where you make a plan about whether to negotiate and what to negotiate about. If you have established that there is competition in the market and you will benefit from negotiating with bidders or suppliers, then build this in your plan. Remember, negotiation is not free, which means what? Which means you'll need to figure out negotiation objectives, plan, and resources. How much effort should you allow for, and will that effort actually be worth it? So those are some of the things that you need to figure out at this stage. Next, pre-procurement, market test, and market engagement, which is where you actually do supplier conditioning. Okay? It may be sensible to engage with some or all of the market players. But the reason why you do this is so that you can gain insight into what the market actually looks like, or, from the supplier's point of view, if you are going to buy or if you're going to purchase, if you're going to sell, it's pretty much the same thing. But in this case, you're assuming you're buying. So you want to gain insight into that market, because you can just rush in and then you spend money and then you can sit back and 1 week later you realize that, well, there were, better alternatives to what you've just spent money on, except the money is gone. And if you have a boss, they're aware of that. And yeah, in some markets, there may be insufficient suppliers or evidence of monopoly or cartel behavior. So you may need to undertake reverse marketing or market shaping. Which means what? Which means if the market is, crowded, or not really crowded, if somebody is monopolizing the market, then you may want to figure out how to get that thing from new entrants or new suppliers who are not necessarily in that market. Okay? Or you may want to figure out if there are alternatives that could actually solve the problem you have in case of a monopoly. Because the problem with monopoly or monopolistic competition is that the supplier has all the cards. In this case, they have the bargaining power is high as opposed to you as the buyer. Next, development of requirement documentation. So the main concern at this stage is just to develop the sort of documents that you're going to use, or that you're going to go to the market with. Things like request for quotations or request for proposal, whatever documents you're going to use. So you develop them at this stage. You see, there really isn't much negotiation going on here, because you now have a plan and now you need to figure out how you're going to start communicating with your suppliers. Okay? Or in this case, the potential suppliers. Next, supplier selection. This will involve shortlisting of suppliers from a large number into a smaller number. Again, there isn't much negotiation going on here because you've already identified the people you want. Now, remember, as you are figuring out the supplier you're going to deal with, these are the people you're really going to negotiate with on specific level. Because everything you've been doing up to this point has been either internally or hypothetical or based on research. Now we are preparing to actually meet the suppliers and start the actual negotiation. Number 7, issue of invitation to tender or request for proposal. Again, so the important thing here is you want them. Again, the thing you want to understand here is that it's not always the case that all the purchasing process will follow this, because at some point you may not really use tenders. But if you are doing public procurement, then you must use tenders. Well, it is a good idea to use tenders because then it makes it open for all suppliers to compete on equal grounds. Okay? And then next, bid or tender evaluation. And this is where the negotiation now starts. I mean, the commercial negotiation. Not negotiation started at the need identification, but this is where now you start talking with the suppliers and they're like, okay, this is what you're going to supply for this much, and these are our terms. And then you're like, I don't like those terms and things of that nature, based on what they gave you as their bid. Okay, so you go through the bid and all that, which means contract award based on whether you found out the person you wanted, after evaluating the bids, delivery of goods and service, and then contract performance review, and then supplier relation management and development, and of course, the end of contract. Remember, negotiation can take place at any of those stages, because take something like contract award, okay, the relationship between supplier selection and rather the timeline between supplier selection and the contract award. In between there, you can still have post-tendering negotiation, which is something we'll look at later in this video or in the next video. So a negotiation can take place in any of those stages. And you have to be good at it, because that is your procurement cycle, okay? Okay, so if you're negotiating in sourcing process, you're going to play one of the following two roles. Acting as the company's sole negotiator with the sales negotiator of the suppliers, usually the case with low value non-critical items, or number two, acting as a leader of a cross-functional negotiation team, usually in the case of high value, technical, complex, or strategic contracts, and for the development of long-term supply relationship management. And when you're talking about negotiation during the sourcing process, the only thing you need to understand here, among other things, is first of all, you need to figure out how does the whole sourcing cycle or sourcing process takes place. So here's how that happens. Number one, you're going to have, you're going to define the specification, the need specification. So what do you really need? And then you're going to develop contractual terms, after which you source the market, okay, to identify potential suppliers. So you have a problem, the need, okay? Then of course, based on your specification, you come up with the terms that you expect the other party to meet, in this case, the supplier. And then now you are in the market looking for who the suppliers are going to be, right? Sourcing for suppliers, and appraise the suppliers, and then invite quotation, send invitation to tenders and things of that nature. Analyze the quotations if they've sent them back, and then select the most promising supplier. And you negotiate for the best deal at this point, because you've identified the supplier, and then the question is this the best you guys can offer? What else can you do? It's sort of like post-tendering negotiation, right? But so you do that, after which you award the contract, and then you manage the contract. And as you're managing the contract, other problems are going to rise, which is the reason why you have this stage called identify the need requisition, and then that leads you back to that need specification, and then it's just cyclic, because normally you solve one problem and another problem arises, which is pretty much how that works, or rather how that takes place. So in sourcing, that's the sourcing cycle, which means if you're negotiating at this point, same to the procurement cycle, it's a question of figuring out which level am I in and what is required of me at this stage. So at this point, it's fairly obvious. We do know that it's not a must for us to negotiate in order for us to get a deal or to get a best agreement in procurement. Okay, we know that it's not a must for us to negotiate. There are a number of ways. To award a contract, and the method used will typically depend on the nature of the purchase or company policies. The organization, okay, or an organization in this case, can just send an inquiry to a selected number of suppliers. So inquiry could be in the form of request for quotation. And then from that, they just do that. They select the people they want to deal with. So this inquiry, if they have to send an inquiry, the inquiry can be something like a request for quotation, a request for information, or a request for proposal. The question then becomes, what sort of details are going to be entailed or are going to be included in those inquiries? And we're talking about things like the contact details of the purchaser, the quantity and description of goods and services required, the required place and date of delivery, the buyer's standard terms and conditions for business. After which, the organization will then require the supplier to submit either a proposal for the job or their price for doing the job, and that's pretty much how that stage goes. How do you choose the supplier? Now, you can choose the supplier on a number of bases. Okay. The question is, okay, you sent all that stuff. You requested for quotation and then they were sent. But then now, how do you select which supplier to work with? And you can do this by, choosing them on the basis of negotiation regarding price and other terms, or on non-negotiated competitive tender basis. So when do you use competitive bidding? You can use competitive bidding when the following conditions are in place, or when the following things sort of make sense to you. Like the value of the procurement is high, the specifications are clear, because if you don't know what you want, then you can't tell somebody to do it for you. Okay, if you know what you want, I want a website, I want it to be ABCD, then the person who does it the best, that's the person I'm going to pay. Because at this point, you know what you want, and you know you're going to evaluate it. Number 3, there are adequate number of potential suppliers in the market. The potential suppliers must be both technically qualified and keen to win the business. And finally, there must be sufficient time available for the process. But what about negotiation? What if you want to negotiate? Okay, which is just another way of saying, what if you don't want to use those alternatives and you actually want to negotiate with the person? Because if you're using competitive bidding, you just don't want to negotiate as much as you'd have done if you aren't using it. So when is it a good idea for you to negotiate? Well, it is a good idea for you to negotiate if it is possible to estimate the production cost accurately. The price is not the only or most important criterion. Changes to specifications are likely, and special tooling or setup costs are a major factor in the requirement. That kind of tells you that. But then the question becomes, or rather another question that you have to figure out an answer to is, as a buyer, what are some of the things that should constitute, what are some of the things that should be part of your objectives when negotiating? And so in this case, we're talking about things like to obtain a fair and reasonable or advantageous price from the quantity and quality of goods specified, to exert control over the manner in which the contract is performed. Okay, so you can do that through things like terms and conditions or through specifications. So if you're negotiating, those are some of the ways that you may want, those are some of the things that you may want to bring out to help you control the way the contract is actually going to be performed. Another objective that you should have in mind is to persuade the supplier to give maximum cooperation to the buyer's company, and finally to develop a sound and continuing relationship with competent suppliers. So you know when you should not really bother negotiating, you know when you should be negotiating, and you also know what objectives you should have in mind when you are negotiating. I mean, we are making progress, right? Of course, if there is a question, you can go ahead and ask that. Okay, so even if you've figured out the supplier that you want to deal with, and so the next thing is to actually give them or to award the contract, you may still need to clarify some things, or there may still be a need for some things to be clarified. This is where post-tendering negotiation comes in. What exactly is post-tendering negotiation? Post-tender negotiation is the negotiation after receipt of formal tenders and before the letting of contract with supplier or contractor, with a view of obtaining an improvement in price, delivery, or content in circumstances which do not put other tenders at a disadvantage or affect their confidence or trust in the competitive tendering system. Meaning what? Meaning, as I pointed out earlier, in the in the procurement process, right? So you've gone through all that, and what has happened is that you requested for expression of interest, and these people sent their bids, and you evaluated the suppliers, and now you have 2 or 3 suppliers that seem competent. Of course, you have one that you'd rather work with, right? So now what is the next thing? The next logical thing is to award the contract. Except you're still thinking, is there a way that you can get this price low? Or is there a way that you can speed up the delivery of this thing? Or, whatever. There is something that you simply need to clarify that doesn't really put other tenders at risk. So what do? At this point, you renegotiate. Okay? So this sort of negotiation is what is called post-tender negotiation, because the tender, the tender's already taken place, right? I mean, it hasn't been done, but in law, we think of this as attempted performance, okay? So they've already submitted their tender. So before you award the contract, you're like, can we talk about this? What do you think is going to happen if we do this? So that is post-tender negotiation. Quick guidelines for buyers regarding post-tender negotiation. Number 1, to ensure transparency, have at least 2 members of the purchasing organization in the post-tender negotiation meeting. Number 2, the negotiator from the purchasing organization should have cleared their proposed negotiation strategy with relevant managers before entering the meeting. So this way, we don't sound like if we are negotiating behind other people's back or doing something in bad faith. Because there are legal implications to those, at least to the contract. Next, notes of the meeting should be taken to ensure that a record is kept of the negotiation and conclusion, because this is a good practice. I mean, you do say a lot of things and then you probably don't write them down, only that you get into a contract and you expect those things you said to be done in the contract, but then you end up having a problem. The problem is expressed terms versus implied terms. And then there is something called the parole evidence rule, which simply says only things that are written in a contract are supposed to be part of that contract. And we shouldn't really be adding verbal terms to a contract. Of course, there are exceptions to that. We are not doing contract law at this point, okay? Now, next, buyers should conduct the negotiation in a professional and ethical manner. If the post-tender doesn't work with this particular supplier, post-tender negotiation, then that means you can move on to the second preferred supplier, because at this point you had like 3. You're like, we've settled to these 3 and we are going to have, some small talk, and then we see who we are going to work with, which supplier we are going to work with at this point. So you can just move on to the next one. Okay, so regarding contract and relationship management, once contracts have been negotiated and signed, there will be obligations and actions to be followed up on either side. And in the event of any misunderstanding, negotiation is going to be used to find a solution. If events or contingency arise, the contract may or may not lay down what happens next, and a way forward may be determined jointly through negotiation. Okay? And something else that happens during this case, if you're managing the relationship, is that if performance fails to conform to agreed terms and standards, there'll be a variety of options for pursuing the dispute, enforcing the terms of the contract, or gaining remedies. Again, negotiation is going to be one of the alternative choices here, because it is an alternative dispute resolution mechanism. Again, this just goes to point out why you really need to be good at negotiation, not just because you want to get what you want as far as the representations are concerned, but also because it helps you to manage risks as far as contracts are concerned. It's part of the dispute resolution mechanism. And finally, circumstance and requirements may change over the life of the contract. And that will also mean that you need to renegotiate the amendments, okay? Or you need to renegotiate so that you can fix some of those changes. One of the major roles that procurement plays is to develop and maintain cooperative working relationship in the organization and in the supply chain. This can be achieved through things like cross-functional consultation, team working, as well as through effective contract and relationship management. The trick is to figure out how to manage these ongoing, differences between the parties you're working with, and differences in things they want, because those are some of the things that will end up resulting into conflict. So conflict, in this case, can have positive and a negative side. And the question then becomes, when is conflict positive? Conflict can be constructive if, number one, it brings out new options and solutions to a problem, if it leads to a clear definition of power relationship, it encourages creativity and testing of new ideas, if it brings out pent-up emotions in the open, or provides opportunity to release hostile feelings that might be depressed. All that, okay? All those are going to help in negotiation because they're going to act as a drive to negotiate. But then again, conflict can also be negative. And when can that happen? This occurs when conflict distracts attention from the task, act as a barrier to communication, subvert objectives in favor of secondary goals and agendas, encourage defensive or spoiling behavior, as well as stimulate emotional, win-lose conflicts or hostility towards each other. And so at that point, you quickly realize that you need to resolve those conflicts, or you need to reduce that kind of conflict. Of course, the question is, how do you do that? Okay, so let's talk about that. There are a number of factors. Okay, there are a number of factors that can give rise to conflict in a business setup, and we're talking about things like interdependence of shared resources, because if people are really working and the resources are limited, then everybody always assumes that they want what they want, and whatever the reason they have for wanting that thing is important. And the other person's reason is not as important as theirs. And so that can cause conflict, okay? So sharing resources is actually a good way for conflict to arise. Number 2, difference in goals and values as well as perception. Number 3, power imbalance, because power is the ability to influence, and the people who have it tend to use it to get what they want, and the people who lack it tend to feel oppressed by the people who have that power, and in between resentment can arise. And so the power imbalance can actually create conflict in organizations. And next, ambiguity, because if you aren't clear about what is to be achieved and the other person is operating based on that lack of clarity, then at some point something is going to happen. And that thing is, somebody is going to ask, why wasn't this done? And the other person is going to say, but I thought this is how you said we should do it. And therein lies the problem. Common forms of conflict in an organization will include things like institutionalized conflict, for instance, trade unions and management issues, functional conflict, typically as a result of clashing of goals and competing for power, okay, and resources, line staff conflict, example here, the production function versus support functions such as procurement, resource conflict, as well as political conflict. So as a procurement person, okay, rather if you are that, then you probably wonder, how is my procurement role, or rather how is the procurement department going to be part of this? So you're talking about areas, okay, areas where procurement function will clash with other functions, and those areas will include issues relating to cost reduction. Think about it this way. The marketing people, okay, the marketing people want to spend as much as possible to spread the word. And the accounting people want to conserve money. Now, if it is something to be bought, okay, so the accounting guys are like, you guys need to spend this much. The procurement team need to spend this much. And the marketing guys are, no, we want this much. And so you see, that's a problem, because it comes down to cutting cost. And then as a procurement person, you're in between there. Number 2, specification, whatever you think you want, versus, or rather whatever they think they want, and then whether you think that thing actually makes sense, that can cause conflict. Supply priorities, that's a problem, as well as budget allocation and priorities. That is conflict between the procurement department and other functions. But what about conflict within the procurement department? Because remember we said the first stage in a procurement cycle is need identification, and that calls for internal negotiation. So what could actually cause conflict within the procurement team itself? And we're talking about things like disagreement about needs, goals, values, or even priorities, poor communication, interpersonal relationship, competition over scarce resources. That can be a problem. Okay, so all that is internal, right? What about external? What could be the cause of conflict between, say, the procurement and the suppliers, or between the organization and the suppliers? So what are some of these things? Because you see, if you know what causes those conflicts, then you start to have an idea of how you can try to fix it. And so in this case, with suppliers, we're talking about problems relating from things like late or unreliable payment by the buyer, perceived unfair or harsh treatment of the supplier by the buyer, frequent changes to design and specification, creating operation and cost burdens on the supplier, unethical dealing by either party, poor or unreliable performance by either the supplier or the buyer, broken expectations or promises. So most of these things, you're going to look at them, or they're going to determine, most of these things are going to determine how you are going to go ahead, okay, how you're going to handle, or the approach you're going to use when you're negotiating. Also, the approach you're going to use when you're negotiating can also cause some of those things, because if you're using an adversarial approach and you think you've just won, then you've actually compromised the relationship with that supplier at some point. And so those are some of the things that can be future problems that you've just created currently that you're not even aware of. A team can be defined as a small group of people with complementary skills who are committed to a common purpose, performance goals, and approaches for which they hold themselves basically jointly accountable. Why would you use teams in procurement and supply? Mostly because they facilitate the performance of tasks which require the collective skills, experience, or knowledge of more than one person or discipline. Number two, the coordination of work from different functions required for business process. Again, the reason why you may want to use a team is because of the interaction, the communication that goes on as far as the team is concerned. And that is important because it will allow for testing and ratifying decision. It also allows for consultation, negotiation, and conflict resolution because of that exchange of various viewpoints, between the team members. That is something positive. Also, the reason why that interaction is important is because it allows for collecting and disseminating information because of the multiple networks in which members are involved. Also, it allows you to generate ideas, bouncing ideas as far as team members are concerned. Because you may think you know something until somebody else pokes a hole on that thing, and then the entire idea just crumbles. And that is good to a certain degree because it helps you not to expose your ignorance. That's the thing. You thought this is what the suppliers wanted, and then your friend says, I don't think price is important here. Maybe what they're really keen on is strategic alliance. And then you realize, then that's the thing. That changes the whole approach of negotiation. And that only works if you're talking to your team members. That is one of the reasons why communication in a team is also important, which generally just talks about why teams are important in negotiation. In the field of team management and employee relations, there are three main contexts in which more or less formal negotiation may be required. You're talking about number one, grievance and conflict handling. And these will be the sort of complaints that are between the employee and the employer. So in that case, negotiation is important. Number two, group problem solving, in which individuals and groups with differing interests will inevitably have to cooperate with each other on shared tasks or for mutual benefit, for example, in the case of supply chain. So the terms of such relationships and exchanges may need to be negotiated, in which case we'll need to negotiate on things like how roles, staff, and resources will be allocated to, say, a project, how contract management staff will liaise with consultants or outsourced functions, among other things. Number three, negotiating terms and conditions. That is also something that will be formally done. How about informal negotiation? When do you use informal negotiation as a leader when you're dealing with your team? You see, all this is just part of team management, right? So informal negotiation will come in situations like to resolve interpersonal and task-related conflict, to informally negotiate roles and tasks allocation, to reach mutually acceptable team-based decisions, or to exercise leadership, which just means trying to take people from point A to point B and they don't want to go to point B. So what do? You could negotiate with them on how they're going to get there and what they look like when they get there. Things of that nature. Now, the first obvious question here is, who are stakeholders? Stakeholders are people, They are persons who can affect or can be affected by the organization. So these are people who, whatever they do, or whatever they do, whatever they do can affect the organization, and also whatever the organization does can affect them. A stakeholder of a company is an individual or group that is either harmed by or benefit from the company, or whose rights can be violated or have to be respected by the company. An organization has both internal and external stakeholders. The people you're dealing with, like your suppliers, those are external stakeholders. The executive in an organization, those are internal stakeholders. In commercial negotiation context, who are the stakeholders that you may end up dealing with? In commercial negotiation, Stakeholders would be individuals or groups who have stake or interest in the process of negotiation, okay, or they're interested in the outcome of the negotiation. So examples of such will be the negotiators who are directly responsible for both the process and the outcome. So basically individuals who are interested in how the negotiation is conducted and what the outcome of that negotiation is going to be. Number 2, contract managers who will be responsible for monitoring and managing the performance of the agreement reached. Number 3, members of both organizations who will be responsible for implementing the agreement reached. Users of the product and services, the budget holders or financiers of the procurement, as well as senior management of both organizations. So these are all people who are going to be involved in or who are going to be stakeholders in your commercial negotiation process. And you need to understand them, you need to know them. You just don't walk into a negotiation without knowing who the stakeholders are, because these are people who are pulling strings, okay? And so you might think you're very good at negotiation, except the other people are like, nah, don't say yes to this and don't say no to that, and pretty much. And so it doesn't really matter how hard you negotiate. The other party has people, okay, or persons behind them whom they are answerable to, okay? So at this point, I want you to think of a football game or soccer if you're from North America, or basically America. So in a football stadium, we have something like this. In this case, A represents the negotiators appearing for our team, which will include basically the people who are negotiating on your behalf. B represents negotiators appearing for the other team. C represents indirect actors on the sidelines, okay? Stakeholders who actively influence the negotiation. So this could include the cross-functional project or procurement team, senior users or budget holders, or even senior management. And then we have D, who represent interested observers, okay? So these are more remote stakeholders who have stake in the process or outcome, but are unlikely to exercise direct influence on the negotiations. Examples of such could be shareholders, competitors, regulatory bodies, etc. Or even trade unions. That gives you a picture. That gives you a picture of what happens, okay? Of what happens in a negotiation and the stakeholders involved. So we have the person you're negotiating with, we have the people who could, okay, indirectly or directly influence that negotiation outcome. And then there are just people who are just watching, they're like, let's see how this one goes. This company wants to buy that company, okay? Except that company hasn't been paying their taxes. They do that and then we get them. I mean, we have all that stuff of, all those kind of people involved in the negotiation process. So with stakeholders, you really have to understand, or you really have to know who are the stakeholders, or who are the people who are likely to affect or be affected by this negotiation. I mean, it's not just sitting on a table and then starting to say something and then like, I'm not taking this deal and I want you to take that deal. That is not it. I mean, negotiation is bigger than that, okay? Here are the reasons why a failure to achieve negotiated internal agreement will cause serious problems. Now remember, as a buyer, your responsibility is to make sure that the people you represent are happy with that negotiation, okay? And if you don't do that, what could possibly go wrong? Well, here are some of the things that will go wrong. Number 1, resources will not be available because you are trying to get a deal, but you're not interested in that deal. You're not going to support you. You're not going to give you resources. So you always want to make sure that your stakeholders, your internal stakeholders, are on team. Number 2, implementation will falter because you have a deal. You've got the deal, right? And then you expect us to implement that deal. Except we weren't part of that deal. So now you go ahead and do it on your own. So that is the reason why some of these things are not sustainable. Number 3, there is risk of internal resistance or sabotage. Number 4, team members will lack a common voice. Also, there is a risk of alienating internal supporters. And the important thing with that is that you really need to be good at internal negotiation, because unlike external negotiation where there is a walkaway position, you're like, this supplier isn't giving me what I want, and so I'm going to get a deal with the other supplier. With internal negotiation, you don't have that luxury. You're not going to walk away from your company, okay? I mean, so the marketing team wants something. And the accounting team are not really on board 100%. And then you think, I'm just going to skip the accounting or I'm just going to skip the marketing either way, you're not going to run away from that problem. You have to fix it because you need to secure agreement with both parties because both parties are part of the internal stakeholders. That is the reason why you need to secure an internally negotiated agreement before you even bother going out there. Okay? So let's sum this up by talking about how you can map and basically manage your stakeholders. And you can sort of prioritize your stakeholders in terms of power and interest in order to determine which third-party interest they may be representing in the negotiation, whether this strengthen or weaken their bargaining position, and what outcome or outcomes, once agreed by the negotiating parties, may be supported or resisted by third parties. Mendel's power interest matrix is actually a good way to go about doing it. Okay, so it's one of those tools that can help you to really go on with this process and actually achieve success. Here's how the matrix works. Okay, the matrix is actually based on two things. It's based on power and it's based on interest. Power is the ability to influence, or as Johnson and Wheaton puts it, the ability of individuals or groups to persuade, induce, or coerce others into following certain course of action. So in the case of stakeholders, this will actually include the ability to influence how the procurement takes place, or the ability to influence how the negotiation in this case takes place. For example, customer could stop buying your product, suppliers could stop supplying, although the question of the effect would depend on how big the suppliers are. Government policies could affect your business, and so on. Knowing how a stakeholder can influence your business is one thing. Okay, that is just power. But then the other thing is knowing whether they're actually going to do it, or whether they really want to do it, or they're interested in doing it. That is where interest comes in. Interest means the likelihood that the stakeholder will use that power, basically the strength of their motivation to do so, based on the strength of their interest in a given issue or decision. So in the case of the matrix, okay, here's the thing. This matrix works in a simple way. You draw a 2x2 matrix that enables you to classify your stakeholders into relevant quadrants, which best describes them by their power and interest level. So you end up with something like this. So in this case, we have A, that is minimum effort. The stakeholders in these groups are the type that are not interested in the organization and do not have much power either. An example here could be the suppliers with whom the organization only does small volume of business. Now, the decisions relating to these stakeholders have a low impact. What you want to do here is ensure that you do not waste resources taking these suppliers' goals or potential responses into account. And then you have the stakeholders that fall in quadrant B. So these are the ones that you can to keep informed. These stakeholders might have high level of interest in your organization, but low power. They are important because if these are not kept on the know about decisions, they may seek additional power and influence the running of the organization. Okay, so some of your workers would be in these categories, okay? Or imagine running a hospital and having volunteer groups. So these groups provide services that are nice to have, but is not necessarily essential. So the volunteers may have interest, but they have less power. What is recommended at this stage, okay, when you're dealing with people from this point of view? So the recommendation is to keep these stakeholders informed of plans and outcomes through communication and stakeholder meeting. And then you have people who fall in the category C. So keeping satisfied. Here you find stakeholders with high power, basically high ability to influence what the organization is up to, but currently have low interest in the organization. So this group is important because if they are dissatisfied or get concerned, their interest level may arouse. Example here could include government agencies and regulatory bodies, okay, or even large suppliers. So the strategy to use with these people is to keep them satisfied so that they do not exert their influence. And then you have the key players, that is group D. So in this quadrant, you end up with stakeholders who have lots of influence and are highly motivated to express their own interests. So this could be your major customers, your key suppliers, the senior procurement manager, etc. What can you do here? Okay, because these are the key players. The strategy to use with this stakeholder is one of early involvement and participation. This way, their goal can be integrated with the organization's goals, ensuring their support. Now that is the Mandela's power interest matrix. Now the whole point of that matrix is, number one, identification of stakeholders whose needs and expectations can change the organization's policy and priorities. Number two, knowing the sort of stakeholders whose interests will be most affected by actions taken by the organization and consequences of such. Number three, identifying stakeholders that need constant involvement. And number four, to help prioritize stakeholders' interests to allow for efficient utilization of resources or leverage for maximum advantage. Now, once you've identified the stakeholders, then it's important, or the next thing that is important is for you to come up with a management strategy. And your management strategy could include something like, number one, goal analysis. Okay, what motivates the stakeholders? What are their goals or desired outcomes from the negotiation or agreement? What fears or issues might arise from them? Where might they support or oppose? Number two, desired customers. What do you want or need from these stakeholders? What level of support do you want from them? What roles would you want them to play, either in negotiation process or implementation of the agreement? Number three, the relationship management. How will you manage communication to and input from each of these stakeholders? How will you keep the key supporters motivated? How will you win over or neutralize resistance? How will you engage the interest of potential stakeholders? Number four, we have issues management. How will you raise potential issues and problems, okay, where these stakeholders are involved? And number five, you have the danger signals. That is, what kind of behaviors or response might indicate resistance or lack of commitment and support from your key stakeholders. So at this point, after going through all that, I'm hoping that you're actually in a position to apply commercial negotiation in the work of procurement, because that was the overall goal of all that. So if there is any question, do let me know. I'm Moses, and I'll see you in the next video.